thank the ICR for inviting me, and thank you for coming to listen. I'm going to take you on a little trip. Once upon a time, there was a group of animal stories that traveled all over the globe. They crossed the deepest oceans, the driest deserts, the highest mountains. For over 2,000 years, these animal stories journeyed from their birthplace in India, which is what the map is, at the time of the Buddha, until they reached the shores of England at the time of Shakespeare. They traveled under many names, and they took many forms. One name in Arabic was the title Kalila Dimna, another in English, The Fables of Bidpai, and also in English, an unsung Renaissance masterpiece called The Moral Philosophy of Doni, translated by Sir Thomas North in 1570. In their childhood, these animal stories found their voice in the oral tradition of the ancient storytellers. Our own Richard the Lionhearted is recorded as often telling one of these stories after his return from the Crusades. Now, in their adolescence, these stories became precious, handcrafted manuscripts created by scribes, calligraphers, illustrators, and artists. And in their maturity, they turned into printed books. It has been said that these animal stories are traveled more widely than the Bible. As manuscripts or books, over 200 versions exist in 50 different languages. And these animal stories are alive and kicking today after 2,000 years. My purpose this afternoon is to give you a bird's eye view in 5 easy stages of their incredible journey, starting at the time of the Buddha in India and ending up here in England in 1570. It's a journey that takes 2,000 years, so we better get cracking. This is the abbreviated pedigree from 1888. The full pedigree is daunting, but this is the abbreviated one, which is in my recent publication of this book. And what you can see is these colored bits are the 5 stages of the journey. So we start up at the left, what Robert Irwin mentioned, the Jataka tales. Then we go to the Sanskrit, then we go to the Pahlavi, and the Arabic is the turquoise dot of Ibn Makaffa. And then we're going to skip down to 1570, the time of Shakespeare, The Moral Philosophy of Dona. The first thing you notice is, therefore, is that it has many names. In India, this book is called the Panchatantra. In Old Persian or Pahlavi, it was called the Karyak Uddamanak. And Kalila Dimna is the famous Arabic title. The Fables of Bidpai is one of its European aliases. But again, I refer to Sir Thomas North's edition. Now we're going to focus on the 5 easy stages of the Kalila Dimna. So let's begin at the beginning, which is 450 BC, halfway through the lifetime of the historical Buddha, the Jataka tales. The Jataka tales from India are one of the largest and oldest collections of stories in the world. See if we can get Mr. Buddha up. There he is. 2,500 years ago, at approximately 430 BC, the teenage Prince Siddhartha left his family palace in North India, abandoning the trappings of royalty, the grandiose luxury into which he was born. He went in search of reality, of the true life lived by ordinary humans and creatures. And we are told at the age of 35, he becomes the enlightened Buddha and begins to teach his disciples. Now, one of the ways he teaches his disciples is by the use of animal stories, which he tells them. This is not necessarily a definite photograph of that event, but it is, Celanese reconstruction of him talking. It was the only thing I could find which had decent quality on the internet. So these concepts that he's talking about, these animal stories, are related to reincarnation and rebirth in his structure. And the concepts of reincarnation and rebirth were already very widespread in India before Prince Siddhartha's birth. The animal tales the Buddha tells his disciples reflect his years of deep meditation and ascetic practice. They contain, incredible to most of us, the Buddha's memories of his past lives from the seeming endless cycle of birth and death. In all, There are 547 such animal stories, and they're called, as I say, the Jataka tales, or the Buddhist birth tales. In them, the Buddha recounts the cycles of his previous lives in a multitude of forms. He is monkey, fish, elephant, house, horse, mouse, tree, spirit, serpent, king, merchant, cook, warrior, archer, musician, scavenger, Brahmin, minister, king, and so on, and so on, and so on, for hundreds of stories. As I say, all 547 of these stories have only ever been translated into a Western language once in the 19th century, and it's 6 volumes. You can get a very good Penguin edition now. It's about that thick. That's 26 stories. That's about 5%. So if you imagine, it's 470 pages. I mean, so if you imagine you were going to have a whole lot, you're going to read 5,000 pages. It's like this. And I don't know anybody's ever done it. I hope I do someday, because they're amazing, some of these stories. But their structure is not quite what we're used to. It does take a sort of mindset, which I can sometimes find, to get back into this stuff. Anyway, these animal Buddha stories, he adapted them from earlier folk tales about animals, because it seems that there is no race or nation that has not used beast fables as part of its heritage of instructional material. The genre is as ancient as mankind himself, dating back to our days as primitive hunter-gatherers, chanting magical incantations deep in caves, which are lit with flickering torchlight, revealing wall paintings. We know that this happened. We know that there were wall paintings there. We don't have a YouTube video of what was going on there. But people speculate that 25,000 years ago, we practiced mumbo-jumbo in caves to work ourselves up before going out to hunt. And some anthropologists claim that such animal magic helped Homo sapiens sapiens survive till today. That's kind of what I'm talking about, that this goes way back as far as we can imagine in our cultural history or our genealogical history. Sir Richard Burton, and more about him later, suggested that man's use of the beast fable commemorates our instinctive knowledge of how we emerged from the animal kingdom on 2 legs, but still with claws and fangs. So that's a very different perspective than the Buddha. And I'm not saying that the Buddha is Kalila Dimna, but it is definitely a template. So there he is, 450 BC, telling these animal stories to his disciple. This narrative structure of the Jataka tales serves, in my opinion, as the prototype for Kalila Dimna stories. Only some, not many, but some of the Buddha's stories continue with us on our Kalila Dimna journey. The one that's the most widely recognized is the story of the tortoise and the 2 geese. And it's usually pictured with the 2 geese with a stick and the tortoise is hanging on by his beak, trying to keep quiet. So we're now going to the next stage of our trip, which is the Panchatantra, and this is the empire of Alexander the Great, as you can see, and over on the far right, this is when he invades India. With the Panchatantra, we leave the spiritual realm of a prince who gave up everything to become a Buddha. We now enter a far more secular domain, where kings and princes definitely want to hang on to power. The Panchatantra means pancha, 5, tantra, chapters, sections, discourses. This is the first story of how this manuscript came to exist. 100 or so years ago, after the Buddha's death, Alexander the Great invades India. Here is the site, somewhere I just showed it to you, of his great battle in 326 BC against King Porus and his war elephants on a tributary of the Indus River in today's Pakistan. This border on the Indus is the easternmost extent of Alexander's empire. But his soldiers have been traveling for 15 years. They're tired, and they're exhausted, and they want to go home and see their wives and children. And Alexander's ambition is beginning to thin out in the face of massive armies of Indians who have never been defeated. So Alexander and his troops rarely turn home. But he leaves behind 2 generals in charge of the Indus and the Punjab district. Understandably, these Greek interlopers are unpopular, and they'll only stay in office for about 10 years, and then they all go home. One of them is replaced by a descendant of one of the local Indian kings named Dabshalim, and he turns out to be cruel and capricious. A Brahmin philosopher named Bidpai tries to teach the king moderation and justice, but Dabshalim is angry at criticism and has him thrown in jail. Then he relents, and he appoints Bidpai his vizier. He carefully follows the sage's advice, and within a few years, Dabshalim is adored by his subject, and neighboring kings and princes come to sit at his feet and receive information about how to be a better king. Dabshalim asked Bidpai to write his teachings in a book that can be used as a guide for rulers to help them obtain the loyalty of their subjects. So the sage goes into seclusion, and within a year he writes a book of animal stories in 5 chapters, the Panchatantra. Each chapter begins with a question from a king who wants to improve the quality of his rule, and the practical answer comes from the sage Bidpai, telling a complex, as Cyrus says, interwoven tapestry of different animal stories with different voices. The king tries to reward Bidpai with gifts and honors, but the sage says, "No, I'm an old man, I don't want that. All I would like is that you try to preserve this book and guard it." I'm going back to the pedigree. We now have outlined number 1 and 2 of the trip, the first 2 stages of our Kalila Dimna Jataka tales in the Panchatantra. However, as is the way with these old manuscripts, or translations, which I've been able to find, there is another version of how the Panchatantra, after Alexander the Great and his 2 generals leave town. There was once a good and honest king named Amarashakti who had 3 ignorant and lazy sons. Many educational experts offered His Majesty their theories about the 3 princes' proper instruction for managing the kingdom in the future. But nothing was working. King Amarashakti was in despair. His hair grew grayer and grayer every day, and what his sons needed to know in order to rule was just disappearing across the horizon, and he was going to die, and his kingdom was going to lie in ruins. If they didn't learn soon, he was in trouble. In modern management speak, the kingdom had what is called a profound succession problem. Then down from the mountains comes a sage. His name is Vishnu Sharma, who says he can impart to the 3 doltish princes all they need to know to become intelligent and wise rulers. Instruction comes in the form of a daily dose of animal fables. And the whole process can be accomplished, he says to the king, in 6 months, if the princes will pay close attention. They will, says the king. So here's a slide I happened to find, and you can see the king speaking to Vishnu Sharma. He is, of course, the man in the white beard. And the 3 boys, rather nervously hovering around in the background. Vishnu Sharma is explaining his method, and the king is whispering to his son, "Put that sword away now. You will listen to what the man in the white beard says." And they do. For the next 6 months, Vishnu Sharma tells the 3 princes his mix of animal stories. The old man has moved into the palace, and there's no escaping him. But in the end, the princes learn what they have to, and they are clearly well suited for the new burden of leadership which will fall on their shoulders. King Amarashakti is delighted, knowing that he can now die with at least one problem solved. Vishnu Sharma is an old man, as you can see, with his white beard, and he wants nothing except to return to the mountains, which he does with everyone's thanks and blessings, but only after he has penned his stories, the Panchatantra. Thus our book has become a genre called The Mirror for Princes. Instruction given to princes is part of their training to be monarchs. So the Panchatantra's political usage of animal stories has by now veered quite radically away from the Buddha's original spiritual message. We are in Machiavellian territory. Many great names can be associated with this Indian incarnation of these animal stories. I mentioned Sir Richard Burton earlier. He was only 26 when he translated a Hindi version of the Panchatantra in India in 1847. The handwritten notebook containing this first literary effort remained with him until his death in 1890. Then, somehow, it survived, hardly noticed for 156 years, deep in the bowels of the Royal Anthropological Institute in London. It was finally published, believe it or not, posthumously in 2003 in, of all places, Bangkok. So you begin to get this feeling that these stories are not self-contained. They just sort of erupt all over the place. And why would Richard Burton's first effort of doing a translation lie in the bowels of a building in London and then get published in Bangkok? That's the kind of thing that, well, that stimulates my obsession. I'm sorry. We're about to begin the third stage, and the long and short of it is that the Sanskrit Panchatantra slowly becomes famous in India. As king after king in India hears about this wondrous book, every monarch wants a manuscript of his own. Yet obtaining one is not always an easy matter. Why should one king want to offer this practical wisdom, this educational technology to a neighbor who later might become a rival and use it against him? So you tend to keep the book to yourself. Books were rare, like Rolls Royces or something. But eventually, 600 or 700 years later, Vishnu Sharma's word of mouth about this book leaks out, probably as gossip, moving up and down the Silk Route. The news reaches the Sassanid court of Khusru I, who was a great Zoroastrian king of Persia in 570 AD. Here's a picture of him. Quite a chap. If you look carefully, you can see that first of all, the dish is gold, so he was powerful. But what I love is all the different animals. You can see lots of different types of animals. Ibex, and you see water buffalo, and there he is on this giant horse with his bow, and even there's lions up on the top right, and there's something coming and biting the horse, but it's just a marvelous piece, I think that. So he's heard about this book, and he knows it's in India, and he dispatches his personal doctor, whose name is Borzoi, to India with instructions to get a copy at any cost. Now here's the popular, or one of the popular versions of the story, because I'm telling you the stories that are around the animal stories. Inside all of these versions, there are these animal stories. I'm not telling you that. You can read the book, because I would take up all day telling you animal stories. But the story of how the book survives, like Moses in his basket, is what I find amazing. One day, King Khusru reads an old manuscript that tells of a secret elixir that can raise the dead to life again. The book says this elixir is extracted from herbs that only grow in the high mountains of India. Well, King Khusru is obviously quite interested in such a new technology, so he summons his doctor, Borzoi, and says, who knows Sanskrit, but he says, you go to India, please, and find me this miraculous herb to make this elixir. This is from an Arabic manuscript, but that's where one of this story exists in lots of different versions, and one of them is the Arabic. So, laden down with gold and silver to defray the cost of his expedition, and carrying a letter of introduction and sumptuous gifts for the king of India, Borzoi leaves Persia to begin his quest. That's him taking off. The king of India is absolutely delighted to receive Borzoi and gives him a royal pass and guides to help him to go search in the mountains for these magical herbs. The understanding, however, that if Borzoi does find any that work, the king of India wants some too. Perfectly understandable. So, with the help of many local experts, Borzoi combs the mountains of northern India looking for the herbs mentioned in King Khusru's book. But to no avail. Whatever herb Dr. Borzoi tribes, or mixture of herbs, on various donated dead corpses don't work. The dead stay dead. Months pass. And Borzoi nervously comes to the conclusion that the book that first gave King Khusru the information about this elixir is fraudulent. To say that he is deeply stressed about returning to Persia empty-handed would be putting it mildly. But in his darkest hour, a famous Indian sage comes to his rescue. Here he is. And this sage says, look, Borzoi, I think you've been making a literal misinterpretation here. The elixir, he says, is not a concoction of herbs, it's a book. And the story read by King Khusru in Persian is an allegory, not a literalism. The high mountains of India, he continues, stand for the wise and learned men and women of lofty intellect. The herbs are their writings, and the elixir of life is the wisdom extracted from these writings. It is wisdom that revives the dead intelligence and buried thoughts of the ignorant and lazy. So Borzoi thanks this wise man, who we see here. He thanks him profusely, and he leaves the mountains and returns to the court of the king of India to explain the situation. Please, your majesty, he asked very politely, may I have a copy of the Panchatantra to take home with me to Persia for King Khusru? Nay, nay, says the king of India, that book is my most precious possession, locked in my library and guarded night and day by my fiercest warriors. But you're welcome to stay in the palace and read it from cover to cover, if you wish. Well, he does wish, and that's what he does. However, he sets himself the task of translating the book from Sanskrit into Old Persian, also known as Pahlavi. Every day, Borzoi goes into the royal library, talks to the guards, and then sits down and reads the old book, the Panchatantra, which is in the library of the king of India. And then he retires to his room, and he makes a copy in his own writing in Pahlavi. And from time to time, he takes these little packets that he's done, these translations, and he ships them back to Persia in diplomatic bags. So, over the months, finally, this particular task is completed. And Borzoi returns to the court of Khusru and is received with great joy and celebration when he delivers the Indian book that is now a Pahlavi manuscript. Here he comes. There he is. You see him. Mm-hmm. I can't read the Persian, but that's him there, and there's King Khusru. This is from Ashramana, I think. And everybody's saying, my God, how did he do it? So he put it in diplomatic bags, you know. Oh, great. Anyway, the king is terribly happy. And he reads a bit of the book, or has it read to him, and the deep wisdom in it stirs him no end. He even builds a great library in which this book is encased with a Panchatantra, 5 chapters given the place of honor. But because, this is a footnote here, because this is a Zoroastrian kingdom and not a Hindu one, the manuscript's title is changed. It's no longer called the Panchatantra, it's called Kalila Dimna, named after the jackals in the first chapter of the Panchatantra. It is also true that the Persians of yore found it difficult, so we're told, to pronounce Sanskrit words. So it's no longer called the Panchatantra, as it makes this particular part of its trip. As to Borzoi, here we go again. The king offers him riches, titles, anything he wants. Borzoi says no. All I want is a biography of my adventures mentioned in all future editions of Kalila Dimna, so that his role can be preserved and remembered throughout history. So this the king does. He calls his greatest scribe and says, get this man's story down and make it good. Well, it was a good story. So Borzoi was very intelligent. We know quite a bit about his intelligence and his physical skills as a doctor. So this story was written, and then they told it. These are the 4 main characters of the first tantra of the Panchatantra, or of the first book section of Kalila Dimna: the bull, the king lion, and the 2 jackal brothers. And it is the jackal brothers who give the name to all books after it leaves India. So here is a famous storyteller in the court of Khusru I, telling the biography of the noted Borzoi who managed to smuggle in a copy of the Panchatantra back to Persia. So we're now going to the fourth stage of the journey. It starts in the Abbasid Caliphate. This is a really important part because it is because of this period that we do have this book. This map shows you roughly the extent of the caliphate. The early armies of the Umayyad caliphs have spread the new religion of Islam, and the second Abbasid caliph, Al-Mansur, is planning the Great Translation movement, which will fan out from his new capital in Baghdad hundreds of years in the future, benefiting humanity. He is the ruler who instigates the rescue of ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge for our future. An awful lot of emphasis is placed on the preservation of Western knowledge of Aristotle, et cetera, but he also did this other stuff. Here's a picture of Al-Mansur. I think all these pictures of characters from ancient history all come from the same factory in Cairo or something. They all look the same. They're always looking noble, and I mean, I quite like them, but I never can detect a huge difference. I think it's all one artist, but be that as it may. Imagine the hive of activity which is in Al-Mansur's court in 750 AD. He is surrounded by incredible political intrigue, and among his hired scribes is a Zoroastrian convert to Islam of Persian descent. His name is Ibn al-Muqaffa. He can read the Old Persian. He's already a well-known writer and intellectual. He worked for the Umayyad, so he had to be very deaf to be able to switch sides. When he begins translating Kariak or Damanak into Arabic. But again, the title changes for linguistic and cultural reasons. Ibn Muqaffa's manuscript is called Kalila Dimna, or Kalila Dimna in Arabic. It is important to note that each stage of its migration, the collection of tales, is remixed according to local culture and political systems. For example, Borzoi changes the title and some of the Sanskrit stories, and Ibn Muqaffa does the same, changing the Pahlavi title while also adding and changing stories. This is the remix process of cultural exchange. The animals in the stories change too, because, for example, there are no Indian crocodiles in Iraq, so they become tortoises. Let's show you the name changes here. That's the original top is the Sanskrit names, Karataka and Damanaka. Then you can see it becomes Kadirak and Damanak, and then Kalila Dimna. But this is sort of a key to the confusion, I find, of the book. Once you realize, how can the Panchatantra, what's that got to do with this? But it does, because the stories are very much the same most of the way. So, there are four notable points I'd like to make about Ibn Muqaffa's translation of 750 AD. This is the oldest manuscript template that we have in existence. All earlier, my favorite word, posterior manuscripts are lost. There is no Pahlavi manuscript. There are no Sanskrit manuscripts that are older than Ibn Muqaffa's. So he did save it. This is a very disputed area. I'm not going to go too deeply here because you have to be careful what you say, because lots of people think it's their book. I won't do any further than that, maybe later. The second point is that Ibn Muqaffa's rendering of Kalila Dimna is considered one of the first prose classics of Arabic. It is noted for its brevity, clarity, beauty, and its elegance of style. In English literary perspective, Ibn Muqaffa's work of Kalila Dimna, roughly 680 years before Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It is a work which is contemporaneous with Beowulf. Yet today, because of the continuity of classical Arabic, the book is used as a teaching tool for students of Arabic the world over. Ibn al-Muqaffa's Kalila Dimna is the touchstone of Arabic style. Ibn al-Muqaffa's 750 AD Arabic version, by now 2 languages removed from its pre-Islamic Sanskrit original, emerges as the pivotal surviving text that enriches world literature. You can follow our story's progress as they travel. I got to put this up. Yeah, this from the turquoise dot. You can see the enormous influence of this book as it spreads across everywhere. It goes back to Persia. It goes into Spanish because the Arabs were in Spain. It goes Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and now we're going to get down to the bottom right, which is the Moral Philosophy of Doni, and it's called the Moral Philosophy of Doni because it's translated from the Italian by Doni. He wasn't a philosopher, he was just a translator. So, as you see, you can follow the progress of these animal stories as they travel downwards from the turquoise dot there, and Kalila Dimna now goes everywhere, changing as it adapts, but somehow retaining its core intact, including almost always some of the original stories from the Buddha's Jataka tales. There's a tragic footnote to the life of Ibn al-Makaffa. Shortly after he completed Kalila Dimna, a book about animals and survival in court life, he was murdered by the order of Caliph al-Mansur, who suspected him of being a little bit too clever, an insincere Iranian convert to Islam, who might be involved in political treason. When they didn't question it any further, Ibn Makaffa was seen going into a government house in Basra and never emerged. He leaves our story here, therefore, but his influence remains everywhere. Where am I going now? I'm now going to show you the fact that these manuscripts in the Arabic translations and then the subsequent retranslations into modern Persians from the Arabic, they created an explosion of material. And from 750 AD until now, hundreds of manuscripts were made all over the Islamic world, many of them traveling back to Persia and even to India and Tibet. And the medieval kings and rulers each wanted their own copy, and they commissioned them lavishly. Robert Irwin told me just before I started that one of the translations, one of the surviving manuscripts of Ibn Makaffa says, Ibn Makaffa himself says, these stories should be illustrated because it'll keep children interested too. So it's not, there's many different manuscripts of Ibn Makaffa too, but I thought that was quite useful, just for me anyway, maybe for you. Scribes, calligraphers, and illustrators labored to produce more and more beautiful and competing manuscripts. Let's look at some of these now. So this one is one of my favorite. It's Arabic, and it's, well, I find it quite strange because where are they fighting? They're fighting in the air above a pond of fish. How did they do that? You know, I mean, it's a huge jump, Olympic. But somehow it's very beautiful. This is the jackal talking to the lion. Arabic. Now you're beginning to see the Persian influence, where the pictures integrate in a beautiful graphic way with the text, with the calligraphy. Famous story that goes way back to India of the fox and the drum. That's Arabic. The Persian is a little bit more elaborate. Now it's getting nasty. This is the culmination of the first book, where the king is driven by his evil vizier, who is one of the jackals, to distrust his best friend, who is the bull, who he's taking out. This is a very unusual manuscript. It's unlike any other manuscript, and it's in pieces. As you can see, the top bit doesn't relate. It's sort of torn out of a man, and it's related, it's supposedly Mongolian. It's a Mongolian version of the story. It's very different in style. I mean, I love the jackals kind of. By the way, one of the jackals is a good guy. Kalila is a good guy. Dimna is the bad guy. But he wins, you know, evil triumphant in this book, which is why it's Machiavellian. Here's another one from that. The donkey that had no ears or heart. And he's unfortunately listening, and he's about to lose his ears and his heart. and you can see who's going to do it in the bottom. But it's a very different tonality than the others. These illustrations now live as durable conduits of traditional wisdom. They give us the sort of vital survivalist psychology that doesn't require any formal schooling. You just listen to the stories. This is an illustration of in this case it's 2 ducks, but originally it's 2 geese, and the turtle clinging on. They're migrating. They're going to a better pond. They're moving house. So, okay, we'll take you, but don't let go. And this turtle's known for being a little bit talkative, like some lecturers. And so he says, okay, of course I can do it. I'll hang on. So he does for a bit, but then he goes over this village, and these people start saying, look at that stupid turtle. I've never seen anything like that. What a stupid idiot. What's he doing up there? And the turtle says, shut up! Ah! And that's the story. This is one of the real template stories that's in the Jataka. None of these show the turtle letting go, but in my book you see the turtle letting go because the illustrator was an animator. So I'm now traipsing down to our own shores, what I consider this unsung masterpiece by Sir Thomas North. And remember, this is the abbreviated pedigree of the Bidpai literature. Not only is it abbreviated, but it's over 120 years old. So if you tried to do one today, you'd probably need the entire wall. Sir Thomas North, 1570. This is the first English translation done from the Italian. It is Thomas North who later translates Plutarch's Lives into the reference book that Shakespeare used as the source of his knowledge of the Roman world, notably for Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. Now this image of the old man teaching the young boy is from his prologue, and sort of looks like the Buddha, doesn't it? You know, it's the same idea. He's reading a book, not telling a story. What I particularly like, though, that in 1570, I've highlighted that they got all the languages pretty much spot on, didn't they? They knew in 1570 they came from India and went to Persia and went to Arabia, etc., etc., etc. They got it right. Well, since most people don't know anything about it, I always find it amazing that someone knew it then. But they probably knew much more about it then than we know now. Both North's Plutarch and his version of Bidpai were very popular reading in Renaissance England. There's even an engraving, our old friend the turtle and the birds, straight from the mouth of the Buddha. Now, in England, at the time of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's only a small boy, by the way, so don't get too excited. He's only about 8. So we've completed our 5-stage bird's eye view of the travels of Kalila Dimna. Quick, fast pace. One of the most popular books in the ancient world. Here's what we've done. Oh, I haven't finished. Oh. Wait a minute. You're not going to get rid of me that quickly. You're not. I've still got 7 more minutes. The oral, the manuscript, and the book transmission. So we got the Jataka. You can see it. You can read it for yourself. These animal stories still resonate today as they do 2.5 millennia ago. And here's a man telling stories. This is a storyteller in Fez. He gets his crowd by going out and strumming the oud very loudly. And he pulls audiences of 60 to 80. And then he starts telling the story into the microphone while holding his oud. And if people start to wander away, then he bangs the oud again and makes a couple of songs, and then they come back. And he's a master. He is just a master of the oral tradition. I asked some local scholars, some friends at Fez University, if he ever told any Kalila Dimna stories. And my friends were very studious about this. They went out and listened to him. I only just said, do you know? And they said no, and they sent 3 of them went out and they listened to him tell stories. And eventually they came back and said, well, he does tell stories from Kalila Dimna, but he doesn't know he's doing that. He's just telling stories. He's just a storyteller, not an educated man. Oh, well, I thought. This is a quote which I like very much from Sir Thomas North, which tells you about how this book, I think, survived. It survived because every version of it has got this preciousness associated with it. This wisdom. This is constantly reinforced in every version that you read, that this is an important book. Don't lose this book. Don't waste this book. Preserve it. Take care of it. It's really, really important. These stories, Now, why did all these different cultures take that and do it? And this is obviously a Christianized version of that. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I like this, the middle paragraph. This precious gem of knowledge, whoso shall lodge it in the secrecy of his memory shall never lose it, but shall rather augment and increase it with age in such sort that he shall win a marvelous commodity. Thank you very much.